and welcome back to Book and Page. We are moving on to Act 3 today with the trial of Hermione. And we're doing scenes 1 and 2 together because scene 1 is very short. In fact, all that scene 1 is a very brief conversation between Clemens and Dion, who were the servants that Leontis had sent to the Oracle of Delphi to find out whether or not Hermione is innocent. Now, what we find out is they've really enjoyed this trip. It's a beautiful place. They feel really spiritually connected. And they have received a sealed scroll with the answers from Apollo. And they really hope that it will show Hermione to be innocent, because that's what they also believe. That's it for Act 3, Scene 1. Scene 2, on the other hand, is just the actual trial, so it's a little busier. We start with Leontis coming out, and he seems to be showing the sad side of him that can't believe his wife would do this, and he's just so sad over it all. Bull hunked, because when Hermione is then brought out, her charges are run off, and not only is she charged for adultery, but apparently also treason for planning to kill King Leontis. This has not come up before, so I call BS on the "I'm so sad about all of this" line that we get from the start. Now, Hermione, of course, pleads that she's innocent, and there's some back and forth between her and Leontis, including Leontis admitting that he, dropped Hermione's baby girl off just in the wilderness to die. And Hermione's just kind of like, if you're gonna punish me, stop punishing my kids. Hi, Tiggs. Come here. Come here. You know, you want to sit on me while we do this. It'd be kind of like somebody in the middle of, putting me on trial was like, also, I killed your cat. Don't do that. And Hermione finally says, you know what, nothing I say is going to convince you, so I will submit to being judged by the god Apollo. And Leontis is like, excellent, I've sent people to the Oracle of Delphi, bring them out, and read forth Apollo's answers. And the two guys come out and they go, and it's basically Hermione's innocent. She was never sleeping around. The princess is trueborn. Leontis is a tyrant. Yeah, it's basically like everything you said was completely wrong. And that should be the end of it, right? But we have this moment, of course, where Leontis is just like, falsehoods! And it seems then he's punished for this, because immediately after he says, whatever you've just read is false, I know I'm right, a servant comes in and tells him that their kid, Mamilius, has died. He was unwell, and he has passed away. And Hermione hears this. This is the second kid she's now told has died, and she just drops then and there. She's like, God is punishing me, and she just drops. So Hermione is carried off stage by Paulina and the other ladies, and Leontis is like, oh God, I have made mistakes. I'm sorry. And just as he's saying this, Paulina re-enters to tell us that Hermione has also died. That her heart just kind of... because both her kids are now dead, right? And Paulina just, again, goes into that visceral anger, screaming at Leontis. And this time around, Leontis takes it. And everybody's like, oh. And Leontis is like, no, she's right. I deserve this. I have done this. And the moment he does this, Paulina then apologizes for losing her cool and taking it out on Leontis. Yeah, it's really weird, because this is my cat not liking me talk to the camera, even when I'm using both hands to pet her. This is like the midpoint of the play, and seemingly we've solved it. Like, this is kind of, in fact, where a tragedy would end. The bad guy has either realized his faults, or the hero has realized he also went about it poorly, if we're talking about the end of a tragedy, and there are now bodies on the stage. The hero and or bad guy has been punished for his hubris. And usually this is where it would end. Him sort of realizing, the gods have punished me, I took it too far, I deserve this. And somehow, though, we are in Act 3 out of, I just want to verify it is 5. Yeah, out of 5. Like I said, we are at the midpoint, not the end. But we have to keep in mind that, like I said before, this is not in fact a tragedy. This is a sad story fit for winter, but this is not a tragedy where everybody is divinely punished and just bodies litter the floor and there's nowhere else to go. We've sort of hit that point here, and it's a question of how then do we build up from here. There are some hanging plot points. For example, what has happened to the princess? Because we know from that trope of we've dropped her in a field somewhere that within literature that usually doesn't mean the baby's dead. If you have seen any story that starts with a baby getting dropped off a cliff, in a dumpster, in a field, and abandoned, you know full well the story's then going to go on and something's going to happen, that kid's going to get saved. It's a question of, like, is it an animal? Is it other people? Is it a divine being? Something is going to help save this kid. So, it's a question of, are we going forward from here to perceive what happens to this princess? Or are we then going to look at a story where the villain of the piece is actually punished and then reconciles? Are we going to have that recovery for Leontis here from his tyranny to become a better person and a better king? Because, truth be told, usually with villains, especially in Shakespearean plays, that's not what we go for. Richard III gets through his entire play and then dies. Spoiler alert. I'm trying to think of what other... Well, practically all of the villains, right? They're usually not the center of the story, like Richard, but you have villains. They get their comeuppance. That's kind of it. I suppose one of the other closer ones we could consider to something like this would be King Lear. King Lear, for those of you who don't know, about a king who's got a couple daughters. He's old. He wants to split the property between the daughters, and he basically says, I'll split the property depending on how much you love me. And the first two daughters are all willing to, like, fawn over him and say that he's the only person they've ever loved. But the youngest daughter is more truthful, in which to say that she loves her father dearly, but there are other people in her life. For example, her husband. When she gets married, she'll be expected to care for her husband and love him just as much as she does for her father. And this sends Lear into a rage, and he throws her out. And the entire play is basically him going mad, and eventually realizing the mistake that he made. But in that one, King Lear is a tragedy. While he realizes the mistake at the end, there's no real reconciliation to be had. Ultimately, we end up with bodies littering the stage, and nowhere else to go from here except for Lear to die. But that's because we watch this entire reconciliation happen throughout the play for him to come to the realization he made the mistake. That's not what's happening here. Like I said, like, Leontis realizes it here. It takes a little more pushing. He doesn't hear what Apollo has to say and go, oh, I have made mistakes. He has to be punished. He loses Mamilius, who he seems to have still loved, despite the fact that he was his mother's son just as much as his father's. And then he does actually have an emotional response when Hermione dies. And it seems in this moment then that Shakespeare's telling us that the tyranny that Leontis is showing has some sort of root in love. A really twisted root, for sure. But what's being shown here is Leontis is so viscerally angry at Hermione and Paulinus because he loves her deeply. Now, like I said, it becomes a selfish type of love where he just wants to keep Hermione for himself. And Hermione kind of recognizes this because she, just like the daughter in King Lear, has to step him back a moment. He says, I charge you that you love Paulinus. And Hermione has to say, well, I do. But I love him as a good friend of my husband's. As a brother from his childhood who has done much for me and my family. It's this recognition that there are different types of love for different people. And you are never, ever going to have somebody's complete and total love. Now, this, of course, is deeply uncomfortable, because that is not to excuse what Leontis has done. There is a key difference between explaining and excusing. Shakespeare then is explaining that here. He's explaining, if you look carefully, that Leontis is acting the way he is because he is actually deeply, deeply hurt by this portrayal that he's perceived. Not only because he loves Hermione, probably also because he loved Paulinus as a dear friend and a brother to him. And the other side of things, then, is a misunderstanding of himself. Because in this trial, we actually get this moment where Leontis seems to admit that he's concocted this himself. And that Hermione's sin is as he dreamed it. So this is something that's fully started in his own head through the perversion of the love he feels for his wife and for a good friend, and quite possibly also the dislike he feels for himself, the lack of love for himself. Because a lot of times this insecurity is coming from the idea that, of course she loves somebody else, I'm not worth it. So we're getting this moment where Leontis, without meaning to, I really doubt he means to do this, is bearing all of this truth in the trial far more than Hermione is on trial. It is Leontis on trial here. And we get the explanation for what has happened and how we've gotten to this point. Again, I'm not saying that excuses it. Leontis does not suddenly become a good person because he realizes he made some mistakes. He has hurt people. He ordered somebody to take a child and abandon it in a field. That is not forgiven purely because Leontis, and the audience of course, has figured out what brought him to this point. And ultimately, he has a lot more to work through before he gets the forgiveness of anybody. We do seem to have an intervention by Apollo here that says, you figuring that out, not good enough. You have to be stripped of everything. But we're starting to already see the development towards Leontis figuring things out. Not only does he apologize, but Paulina then comes in. And we get this sort of weird moment where, again, we can be uncomfortable with it if we mistake explanation for excusing. That is to say, Paulina comes in, basically starts screaming at Leontis again about how he's caused all this, and Leontis takes it, and somebody tells Paulina, like, calm down, he's recognized it. And then Paulina does that turnaround that we didn't see last video. I spoke about Paulina and about how the fact that she went at the king, and even when he threatened her, never turned around and said, sorry, I'm just being a foolish girl, please forgive me. We have that turnaround here. And it seems like a really weird point, because it seems like Paulina, who's been the strongest woman that we've met in this play, suddenly has this turnaround where she's like, cool, everything's forgiven. I don't think that's actually what's happening. I think what's happening is speaking to the strength of Paulina as well. That she can recognize human nature and human error in Leontis, even at his worst and at her lowest. She's just lost a very good friend in Hermione. She's just lost 2 children that she had an attachment to. That would be Mamilius and the little girl. And she comes back in ready to rip Leontis apart. But the moment someone says, wait, he's hurting too, she recognizes that there is a moment where we can save more people. There is this moment where Paulina sees Leontis and stops. Because she's realized that, in a lot of ways, if she were to just keep pushing him, hi, I am paying attention to you, honey bun. Not enough, apparently. If she were to just keep pushing him, we would either end up with a third body, or the problem would never get solved. Right? If everyone were to, you know, rightfully so, considering his actions, treat Leontis like a tyrant, and like a tyrant who's never going to change, then when do we have that moment where he says, if everyone's going to treat me like a tyrant, I'm going to be a tyrant? We're seeing this moment of, are we going to keep the villain as the villain, or are we going to give him a chance to be better? Are we going to give him a redemption arc? Or are we going to say, too late? And again, this is hard, because this is a play that I think very on the nose addresses the issue of domestic abuse. Be that physical or verbal and mental abuse. We have this moment where Hermione is so trapped by her husband's power that despite everybody seeming to say that she's innocent, including the 2 servants who have gone to Delphi where they're like, I sure hope this proves Hermione innocent, very few people are willing to stand up and say anything. And say to Leontis, you're being a dick, you're being abusive, you need to stop. Paulina is willing to, but we've seen how ineffective that is. So when we have this moment where it all comes to a head and there's suddenly undeniable consequences to all of this, or at least seems to be undeniable consequences to all of this, there are really 2 perspectives that are fully viable on their own that aren't going to sit comfortably with us. Which is to say that as an abuser, Leontis should be punished. We cannot look at Leontis' actions here and just forgive him, because he has hurt people. He has used his position of power to outright terrorize and imprison Hermione. To the point where even on her trial, he's willing to tell her he did something awful to their kid. And you are never going to be able to look an abuse victim in their eye and say, forgive him, or forgive her, forgive them, as if they are obligated to do so, because they're not. They have been put through a terrible, terrible thing that nobody should go through. And nobody can then tell them how they should or shouldn't respond. If they choose to forgive, then that is on the strength of their character. But as someone recently pointed out to me, if they choose not to forgive, then that's also on their strength of character. How many people have constantly forgiven things and thus lost self-confidence in themselves? Have started that story of, obviously this person does this because I deserve it. The strength of their character then comes from the fact that they're not going to forgive the person because they didn't deserve to be treated that way. So, looking at this moment and wanting to be Paulina screaming at Leontis is a perfectly understandable and valid perspective. But alternatively, there is the other perspective to look at. And while this perspective is likely, again, more from the dominant side of the culture, it is a question of how much somebody can develop and change. Do we allow Leontis the redemption arc because he has recognized himself as an abuser and is endeavoring to change? Most people tell you that is also, well, a valid perspective. In fact, you yourself probably had some beliefs or did some things or said some things in your past that make you cringe now. That tells you that you've learned from those, you've realized it was inappropriate, and you've endeavored to change. So do we allow Leontis? Paulina here is allowing this. She is coming in ready for somebody who's not willing to change. Ready for Leontis to stand as if a stone had just become part of his feet and say, I'm the king, I had every right to do what I did. Instead, she comes face to face with somebody who actually regrets his actions. And she looks at this moment and says, try and make it better. It's too late, we're told, for Hermione and Mamilius, but maybe it's not too late for Leontis. Maybe in this moment, Paulina is seeing the possibility of an ally in this endeavor to prevent this from ever happening again. So Paulina definitely comes across as a very strong character in her ability to also stop in this moment and say, okay, I will help you change. But she, again, is not the abuse victim here. She is not Hermione. So if we were to turn around and say, at any point, Hermione was expected to act like this, that's not fair on Hermione. Oh, God. I don't think a lot of people realize just how modern day the issues of A Winter's Tale actually are. Because this is just a split problem either way. Whose perspective do you take? Both of them are valid. Both of them have their pros and their cons. Who do we support in this situation? And at what point do you become forgivable or non-forgivable, and by who? Is society expected to forgive an abuser even if the victim has chosen against that for their own mental health? Can society not forgive an abuser even if the victim has decided to forgive them for their own mental health? When does changing become the more important thing versus punishment? These are not easy questions. And the internet today makes it even harder. Because this is precisely the moment a lot of people are facing down. Where things they've said or did previously, because they thought it to be acceptable then, are being brought out and... This was you. This was you. That is exactly what this scene is. Leontis, this was you. And people were hurt because of it. 2 people, in fact, are dead. Probably 3. We probably killed the kid. The kid is assumed dead in this moment. Where do you go from here? Well, I guess it depends on your perspective and what you've gone through. Your experiences are always going to change how you interact with moments like this. And that's why I say reading is always super important. Because it's going to bring in perspectives that you're not necessarily going to see. I am so lucky, so lucky to have never been a victim of this type of abuse. I have never had a partner try and control me to the point where they've made stories about me in their head. I have been able to get away from toxic friendships that have tried to do that. And I'm so lucky because of that. But reading something like this makes me self-critical about my own actions because I don't ever want to be Leontis. It makes me want to hand the microphone to the victims who need to speak out. And that's important. I mean, it also highlights the difficulties of it, the fact that you're never going to have a clear answer. It is all shades of gray. But the fact is that a story like this can make us ask those questions, even if the situation is uncomfortable. And it gives us enough difference here to ask them without necessarily interrogating someone's story directly. We can ask the questions about this fictional abuse situation without making someone feel like they're on trial. Or at least, I hope we can do that. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. It's got to get better from here, right? See you later.